Greetings, everybody. This is for our U.S. History 2 students. We're continuing the conversation with the Progressive Era. And so today we'll be looking at the 6 big problems that progressives were looking at. So the problems which the reformers had to deal with were many and complex. But the 6 problems we're looking at right here can be listed, which embrace, in one form or another, practically all of the particular major problems the progressives hope to eliminate, right? So the 6 problems were, as listed here: confusion of ethics, trust regulations, uneven distribution of wealth, the rise of the American cities, political corruption, and race and gender relations. So, confusion of ethics developed when society tried to take the moral code out in the frontier in a simple agrarian society and tried to apply those values to a highly complex industrialized society. So out in the landed frontier, people were generally seen as independents, and that independence was valued. And their only vulnerability, which was great, but was the the elements of the environment. So this, again, as discussed in social Darwinism, this is where those big 6 values of moral codes were cultivated, right? Social Darwinism, laissez-faire, rugged individualism, all of that kind of stuff. And it worked, at least in theory, well out there, right? That's what created the America that people claimed one should be proud of, right? Well, in a highly complex industrialized society, humans are dependent upon certain elements within society for survival, upon the integrity of certain individuals and companies. People are vulnerable to the elements of complex society because they are dependent upon it for survival. So the more complex society becomes, the more vulnerable people become, right? So out in the frontier for food, you could rely on the environment to provide for you, right? Fishing, hunting, growing your own food. In a highly complex industrialized society, in a big city, the only means of getting food is to have money, right? And so this is where, that's just an example of one aspect of vulnerability as society is becoming more complicated and industrialized. Part of the confusion of ethics were this idea of social sins and responsibility in society. So people are a product of their environment, right? And the environment advocates certain values. So John D Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan, as they're rising in success with business here, they were only doing what society advocated, right? But in doing so, it created social sins and or abuses. And as more of these social sins were committed, pressure was put on government for protection. So out in a simple agrarian society, out in the landed frontier, social and personal morals are one and the same because you're doing business with friends and neighbors, right? And there's a direct responsibility. In most cases, social sins were not committed on purpose within that society. In a highly complex industrialized society, there are 2 sets of moral codes that the progressives were faced with. In business, the moral code was survival of the fittest, and the ends justify the means to make a buck. In personal relationships, the general rule is to treat people honestly as you would a friend. So, in a complex industrialized society, there is also the diffusion of responsibility, which makes social sins difficult to detect and to stop. Diffusion of responsibility developed as a result of the isolation between corporate producer, the marketing system, and the consumer. The complexity of corporate America made it easier for management and the worker to carry out social sins. Hence, the impersonality of social sins, along with the complexity and the diversity of the new industrial society, made it difficult to fix responsibility to any one group. So the progressives had to educate the public in a new morality and to new values in order to make business more responsible and operate on a personal morality instead of social morality. In order to protect people, they had to do basically the following. They had to educate the public to the abuses. This was accomplished mainly through muckrakers, a type of journalism that we'll look at a little bit later. Pass laws to make the social sins or abuses, such as horizontal trust, railroad rebates, and drawbacks, illegal. And third, create administrative bureaucracy. Example, the Pure Food and Drug Administration or the Federal Reserve, right, to enforce the laws to protect individual rights. So trust regulations. Trust regulations could be seen as the new social and economic problems within society developed when the economic base or organization of society changed from a simple agrarian society to a highly complex industrialized society. Trust regulations were Roosevelt's and Wilson's way of dealing with this change in the economic base caused by the rise of big business and the growth of trusts and monopolies. Uneven distribution of wealth. The problem of an uneven distribution of wealth came about because of a small percentage of people had a large percentage of wealth, which provided for a very unhealthy economy. Right? The corporation was the key tool used to create the situation, along with the idea of trickle-down theory of economics or supply-side economics. Right? For example, in the first half of the 19th century, they saw a rise of only a few large fortunes. Most of these came from land or in shipping. During the Industrial Revolution, all of that's going to change, right? An estimate in 1890 indicated that 12.5% of the people owned 87.5% of property, right? It should be noted that these people used their economic power to avoid just taxation and regulation of their property. It also could be noted a lot of these same problems have come up again too. There is this large concentration of wealth and power in very few hands. So the great fortunes of the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries came not from the land, but from the exploitation of workers, as well as natural resources, manufacturing, banking, and speculation. So in 1892, the New York Tribune compiled figures on millionaires of the country, just to show you kind of the concentration and where people were making their money. There were estimated 1,000 millionaires from merchandising, 600 in manufacturing, 300 in banking, 20 in transportation, and only 26 in farming. The rise of American cities. American cities had a rapid, unregulated growth, right? These were not planned during the late 1800s as a result of people moving in at a faster rate than the cities could adjust. This growth created problems such as housing, health, and sanitation, and crime. The number of prison inmates, for example, in the United States increased by 50% in the 1880s, and the homicide rate nearly tripled, with most of the rise occurring in the cities. People were moving to the cities because they saw new opportunities which no longer were available to them in the landed frontier. Political corruption. Number 5. Whether working within the framework of the city, state, or federal government, the reformers frequently confronted the fifth major problem, the prevalence of political corruption. The progressives movements in politics started in the cities, spread to the state, and ultimately reached the federal government. The reasons for the breakdown of the political system were that the administrative organizations inherited from a simpler day could not function under the weight of its new duties, and it lacked financial ability and administrative structure to solve its own problems. Also, the legitimate financial rewards of politics were so meager that able men preferred business and political offices became good only for the extra legal benefits they brought. So it promoted corruption. Finally, race relations and gender relations. With the Compromise of 1877, the position of African American men deteriorated rapidly. From 1877 to 1901, the Supreme Court decision basically undermined their position in society. So, in the civil rights cases of 1883, for example, the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had no jurisdiction over such matters as social discrimination directed by private persons or organizations against persons of a different race or color. In 1896, the court held in Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal facilities satisfied the 14th Amendment requirements that states give equal protection by the law. So as long as the facilities are equal, it's okay if there are separate facilities. African American men were left to fend for themselves and with help of some white sympathizers in the progressive movements as they tried to gain rights in society with two different approaches. One coming from a man named Booker T. Washington. He was a very well-known black leader in the 1890s who looked upon as a spokesman for the majority. He felt that the black man should remain quiet, not be a social or political disturber, and try to improve his economic worth with education and new skills. If he could improve with skills, then society would reward him by giving him social and political equality. Right? So kind of go out there and prove yourself. But Booker T. Washington did argue that schools and trade schools should be supported. W. E. Du Bois was involved in the Niagara movement, which eventually became the NAACPs. He was the director of publicity once it was founded. Du Bois felt the only way African Americans could get equality in society was to gain political rights. So African Americans needed to get laws changed and get their political and civil rights guaranteed before they could enjoy economic and social benefits from whites. Both of these views had merit, but must be done simultaneously, it was argued by many progressives. But in the parlance of the time and with white supremacy at the time, a lot of people are just going to focus on Booker T. Washington's advocacy at this time. We don't have too much time for race, for gender equality, but it should be known that at this time, women were working very hard to achieve what would become the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women's rights to vote in this country, right? Led originally by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, later led by Carrie Catt and Anna Howard Shaw. The last years saw great leaders like Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, who saw the movement through. We'll be watching, for those in my face-to-face class, a film called Iron-Jawed Angels, which looks at the last 8 years of the 72-year movement of the women's suffrage movement. But definitely the women's suffrage movement was part and parcel of the progressive movement. And it finally saw its fruition, its victory in the 19th Amendment in 1920. Anyway, that's it. I'll talk to you guys later with part 3 of the progressive movement. Take care.